This is a story of an inconsiderate mother-in-law, Miss Obina. Mrs. Obina had 7 sons, and because of how she was maltreated by her own mother-in-law, she decided to do the same to her sons' wives. She would go to their houses unannounced, spend as small time she wanted, move to the next son's house, and that's how she keeps rotating the circle, leaving her husband all alone at home. If you ask her, she will say she's reaping the fruit of her labor. She threatens any of the wives that complain. Most times, her sons do not complain. They just follow whatever rules she brings into their home. In their defense, their mother really suffered for them while growing up. The annoying part was that when she gets to their houses, the wives were not permitted to cook except her. She said as long as she was there, the wives had no business in the kitchen. She also made her sons stop their wife from working or doing business, saying they won't have time for their family. The wives of these men were always sad. One day, her last son David told her he had found love and was ready to marry. She asked her son David to bring his fiancée home so that she could assess her. Because David knew the kind of person his mother was, he pleaded for her to be nice. Amara was the lady David was in love with. She was beautiful and was a banker. David was excited as he told Amara over the phone that they were going to meet his parents. He could not wait to introduce her. On that fateful day, she dressed very decently and beautiful that David could not help but to compliment her. David's father happily welcomed them as they got home. Miss Obina was sitting down as David and Amara greeted her. "You are welcome," she said to Amara. "What is your name and what do you do?" she asked Amara. "My name is Amara and I work in a bank." The moment Miss Obina heard the word bank, she shouted, "Hope you are not part of the people that sell their body to their customers all in the name of work. Look, my sons cannot marry a prostitute though," she said. Amara was surprised at her outburst. She quickly said, "No, ma, I'm a very decent person." She looked at the direction of David, but he was mute. "Do you love my son?" Mrs. Obina asked Amara. "With the whole of my heart." "That is to say, you will obey all the instructions." "Yes, I will," Amara said. "Firstly," Mrs. Obina continued, "you will have to resign from your work and stay at home. My son is capable of taking care of you. I don't want you to start rubbing shoulder with him because you are also making your own money. Secondly, before you get married to my son, you must come and live with me for at least 1 month so that I can teach you, groom you well, and prepare you for marriage. All my daughters-in-law went through the same process. Whenever you are ready, let me know." Amara was quiet and speechless, but she had no talk with Mrs. Obina. But David, who had refused to say anything. As they got home, Amara was angry at David. "You could not even say a word. You sat there and watched your mom say all those things to me." David reluctantly responded, "What could I have done? That's my mom's rules. All my older brother wives went through the same process. Why do you think it will change now? Just follow our rules if you really love me." Later that night, Amara began to think, is this the man she was going to spend the rest of her life with? Of course, she knows that David was a good and kind man, but in the presence of his mom, he was a weakling. Even his father had no say in whatever Mrs. Obina does. Is this the kind of family she wanted? Amara got to her house the next day and discussed with her friend Vivian. Vivian said it was not supposed to be an issue. She suggested Amara plays along with Mrs. Obina. After all, it is David she loves, and it was David she was going to be spending the rest of her life with, not his mom. Amara thought about this all through the night and decided to accept Mrs. Obina's conditions for now. Few months later, Amara and David got married legally and went for their honeymoon. After Amara and David came back from their honeymoon, the next day, Mrs. Obina arrived at their house. Amara was very surprised. "Mama, you are welcome. You did not tell us you were coming," she said politely. "So I cannot come to my son's house again," Mrs. Obina responded rudely. Look at this little girl questioning me in my own son's house, she said angrily. Amara kept her mouth shut and waited for her husband to return from work. When David came back, he did not think his mom was doing too much. In fact, he was really happy. That night, Mrs. Obinna refused to let Amara into the kitchen. She made the food herself. She told Amara as long as she was around, she would be in charge of the kitchen affairs. Amara had no right to be around the kitchen without her permission. This rule sounded strange to Amara. She was sad and worried. The next day, Mrs. Obinna called Amara and David and told them it was time for them to start making babies. She told Amara that she needed a grandchild from her as soon as possible. She doesn't want to hear any stories. Mrs. Obinna continued to stress Amara for the next 5 months, non-stop. One morning, Amara asked her husband, "When is Mama leaving? For the past 5 months, I have not cooked in my own house. I am forced to eat whatever Mama prepares or go out to eat. I am a prisoner in my own house. This is not the kind of marriage I bargained for." Sometimes she will barge into our room without knocking. If not for the fact that I started locking the room door, one day she will meet us naked. David told her to be calm, that everything was going to be fine soon. Mrs. Obinna, on the other hand, complained about everything Amara does. Nothing she did was okay. Amara will always talk to her co-wives. They will just encourage her and tell her to be calm. All of them have been through it. Soon Amara became pregnant. David was so happy, including Mrs. Obinna. That was when she decided to leave their house. Amara was glad. She could finally breathe some fresh air at last. She and David were at peace until she finally gave birth to a baby girl. After Amara gave birth, Mrs. Obinna refused to allow Amara's mom come for Omugwo. According to the Igbo's tradition, she said no other person was qualified to bathe her grandchild except her. She had been the one bathing all her grandchildren right from birth. Hers will not be an exception. Amara was sad. She complained to her husband. Her husband begged her to understand. The worst part was, apart from bathing her grandchild, she does no other thing than to sleep, cook, and eat. Amara was so unhappy about this, but decided to keep calm until she left. Mrs. Obinna stayed 6 months before finally leaving. Amara continued to live in peace with her husband until their daughter was 1 year old. Then Mrs. Obinna started again. She started to pressurize Amara and David into having another child. "I need a male child," she will say. She will always call Amara and tell her the necessity of having a male child. "Look at me, for example. I have 7 boys and I'm enjoying myself now." Amara will always tell her she was not ready for a child yet and also cannot control the sex of her child. But Mrs. Obinna was not ready to have it. "You must take him again," or she will always shout. Amara was tired. "Can I just enjoy some moment of peace from this woman? Am I the first woman to be married? Why is my own always different?" She started complaining to her husband. Her husband again suggested they follow his mom's instructions for peace to reign. "You're not even considerate at all." Amara shouted at her husband. "Have you asked me if I'm mentally stable for another child? What is wrong with you? Can you just speak up and stand your ground as a man for once?" They had a huge quarrel and fight. Later that night, David apologized to Amara and begged her to understand his point. They settled and started living in peace. Soon, she became pregnant again. This time around, her pregnancy journey was difficult and stressful. She was always in and out of the hospital. When labor started, Amara's doctor told David that Amara could not have a normal delivery except for a cesarean section, that her life was at risk and he needed to sign a consent form. David decided to call his mother to update her of the situation. Mrs. Obinna said never. None of her daughter-in-law will give birth to a cesarean section. If not that Amara was lazy, what is a normal birth she cannot have? "I gave birth to the 7 of you naturally without surgery and I'm still very strong. Please, my son, let her push the baby out. She can do it." When Amara heard that David was not ready to sign the approval form, she was angry. She screamed in pain. "Do you want to kill me? If I die, I promise you, I will never rest in peace. I will haunt you to your grave." David had no choice than to sign the approval form. In as much as he did not want to disobey his parents, he was scared for his wife's life. Thankfully, it was a successful surgery. Amara gave birth to a baby girl. As soon as Miss Obinna heard this, she was angry. The next day, she came to visit Amara and saw her lying on the bed resting. She started heaping words on her. "Look at the way you are sleeping. One will think you have given birth to a strong and healthy boy, but it's another girl. You are so lazy that you could not even push your baby out yourself. I wonder what my son saw in you. You are so useless." Amara cried her eyes out that day. After she was discharged, she insisted her mom was coming this time around, but Mrs. Obinna stood her ground. Amara was very upset. Miss Obinna came as usual and took over her kitchen and her husband. Despite the fact that she needed absolute rest, she worked herself out. Mrs. Obinna stayed longer than planned this time. Amara had had enough. One night, she refused to sleep at the same room with David. She went to sleep at the visitor's room. David came asking her the reason. "Look, David, I am tired. I am tired. Please let me be. I've endured enough." David began to beg her to come back to the room. After much persuasion, she promised she was coming to join him soon. After David left, Amara stood up and went to Mrs. Obinna's room. She opened the door and smiled. She asked Miss Obinna to stand up. Mrs. Obinna was wondering what was going on. Amara said, "Mama, from today you will take over my matrimonial bedroom. Since you have taken over everything in this house, you must as well take over your son's sexual needs." She began to walk towards Mrs. Obinna. By this time, Miss Obinna was shouting, "Abomination, abomination, abomination." But Amara was fully prepared for her. David had to rush down to find out what was happening. "What is all this, Amara? Have you gone crazy?" "Yes, I am crazy," Amara shouted. "I am tired. From today upward, your mom will be the one sleeping on the same bed with you, while I relegate to the guest room. Your mom is now your new wife from today. Do not ever disturb me." She left and went to sleep at the guest room. The next day, when David went to work, Amara locked Mrs. Obinna's room from the outside. Miss Obinna could not come out. She kept on banging the door. She had to call David. David had to leave his office running home. Amara, dressed very pretty, sat on the couch to sip her wine, unbothered. As soon as David let his mother out, she started ranting as usual. As Mrs. Obinna stepped out, Amara packed all her clothes and burnt them in the compound. When Mrs. Obinna came back, there was nothing for her to wear. David had to go out in the evening to buy few clothes for his mom. He was tired and exhausted already. As soon as Mrs. Obinna and David left the house the next day, Amara began to pack her bag and that of her children. Then she got dressed and called a moving company to help her move some properties. When the truck arrived, they packed almost all the properties, and Amara left with them and her children to an unknown destination. When Mrs. Obinna and David came back, they saw the house was almost empty. At first, they thought it was a forced entry until David saw the letter Amara kept for him. "David, I am done. I can't do this anymore. I have left with the kids. You can stay in the house together with your mom. Goodbye." David started crying. "What have I done to myself?" Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.